Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. I hope you've been having an amazing time at Decoupled Dev Days. If my voice or audio cuts out, please let me know. I'm trying to keep the volume at a normal level because it is 6 in the morning and I don't want to wake up my landlord today. Welcome to Lessons Learned, Leading an Open Team, also known as, I thought I'd come up with a catchier title by the time this happened, but I never got there. So by the end of this, if you have suggestions for what I should call this session in the future, please let me know. My name is Fatima. I'm a developer programs engineer at Pantheon, where I work on developer tools, give trainings, talks like this one at conferences, also write documentation and engage with open source communities. You can find me on the internet as Sugar Overflow, or more notably as of DrupalCon, the effervescent Sugar Overflow. I've been a part of the DrupalCon program team, core contribution mentoring lead, and I was also the former leader of the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. In 2008, I was awarded the Women in Communications and Technology Canada's Rising Star Leadership Award. Wow, that is a mouthful. Before the pandemic, I was an escape room expert and competed in my local axe throwing league. But now I just play Overcooked with friends on the weekends, mess around with my Roomba and watch it bonk into the sofa and just try to stay sane, keeping a good work-life balance. As you can see, I work in my bedroom. It's good to be here with all of you today, and I'm excited to talk about this. A few years ago, I attended DrupalCon for the first time. I didn't know what Drupal was or who the people in the Drupal community were. During that conference, I just happened to wander into this diversity and inclusion booth. I don't remember if I had any particular expectations. I'd always been a really outspoken person, having grown up in New York City and having faced a lot of aggression and racism. I often spoke about these issues and stood up for myself, but it was only in moments of crisis. So every time something bad happened, I had a lot to say about it. But on a day-to-day basis, I wasn't really like advocating for myself or for people like me. At this booth, however, everyone kind of went around in a circle to introduce themselves, and they were talking about their experiences and what brought them to that booth, and how that felt like a safe space where they could feel comfortable to talk about themselves and feel validated. And I remember when it was my turn, my voice was shaking, and I tried to explain why I was there, how hard it was to be a young Muslim woman in technology, especially living in Boston, given the recent events, and how I was struggling to like find a place for myself. And in that room full of strangers and some friends that I had just made, people asked me questions. They validated my experiences. They talked to me more about them, and they just felt like they really wanted to hear my voice. And at that young age, I was just like really overwhelmed, and I was like, wow, these bunches of strangers really want to hear what I want to say. And I think that was the first of many further conversations when Nikki Stevens at that booth went on to create the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. And at first, I used to lurk in the group, attend meetings, do some grunt work, but like keep it at a distance because I wasn't really sure what it meant to me. But over time, I started to use DD&I to learn more myself and educate myself on how to talk about some of these racial issues, how to talk about inclusion in tech communities, and kind of used it as a conduit for my own growth, but also as somewhere where I could put all of this energy that I had about these issues that I didn't know what to do with. And over time, that led to me becoming a leadership team member, working on initiatives for the community. And then after a year, Nikki offered to pass the baton to me. And at first, I was super nervous about being a leader and didn't really know what leadership was going to be like, having been a team member. But the difficulty and the adversity that I faced in the year that I was leader, I think really helped me grow to where I am today, and made it possible for me to be able to talk about what it was and kind of share some lessons that I learned that might be applicable to you depending on where you are in your leadership journey. So at the core of this talk is community leadership. And although I'll focus on, community leadership while doing work in diversity, inclusion, and equity, some of this advice will apply to leadership in general. And it's important to note that that can come in many forms and can look different for everyone. I'm hoping that this talk speaks to people who are already in leadership roles, people of color who are interested in taking on leadership roles, and people who are supporting people in leadership roles. So particularly those of you who work with or support people of color or other marginalized folk and want to find ways that you can better support them in the work that they do. So over a year, digital echidna, living in this small city called London, Ontario, and using all of my to work on Drupal community initiatives for mentoring and for DD&I. And so there were moments where I gave more to the cause than I should have, and I didn't know any better. And, you know, I remember days when my dad would come to visit when he was still alive in this tiny little apartment. It was kind of a studio. And after dinner, we usually would sit on the sofa and we'd watch The Blacklist together. It was our like current TV show. And I was teaching my dad how to binge watch, because at the end of every episode, I'd be like, one more. And he would be like, I don't understand this millennial culture, but sure. And we'd be there for hours. But occasionally when there was something going on in the community, when difficult conversations were taking place, you know, my phone would just be going off with Slack pings or Twitter pings. And, you know, there were conversations that were going on that needed to be moderated. So my leadership team and I were constantly on our toes, you know, moderating these discussions, responding to things, keeping the advocacy going, sharing resources for people who needed education. And so often I would have to like pause our episode and take out my laptop, and my dad would be like, that again? He always debated with me all the time and insisted that, you know, I wasn't being paid for this work. And I was like, yes, but I'm passionate about it. And you don't understand. I'm not doing it for being paid for it or for recognition. You know, it's important work so that the next person that looks like me or feels marginalized in the community will feel like they belong. And we debated that once a week. We debated that in person. We debated it over the phone. And he was like, I think you're spending way too much time on this. I don't think it's worth it. And I was like, no, you just don't understand because you're white passing. But I also didn't realize the amount of emotional labor that I was doing until I didn't have the capacity to do it. And, you know, that was a tough lesson to learn. And it was even more tough to decide that it was time for me to step away from the group. And so as of today, I'm no longer a member of DD&I, but that was a personal decision. And, you know, since my father passed away, it was something that I was thinking about, like, what do I do with this time in a way that's healthy and I don't end up devoting all of my personal time into one thing, and then also feel like I have regrets that maybe I could have spent that time with my father. So I'm trying to be a little more conscientious about the time that I put into initiatives like that. But I'm also trying to be a little bit more understanding about how people sometimes bring their whole selves to open source and diversity work. You know, this work ties into their identities as people. It's dear to their hearts. And it's something that we have to keep in mind, you know, when we engage with people in this context, and something to respect, because this is time and emotional labor and feelings that they're bringing voluntarily and from a really vulnerable place. So if I had to lay out a high level of what I think community leadership could look like, these are the 6 components that I kind of pulled out together. You know, community building includes mentoring, creating systems in which people can learn and grow. Greg Dunlap, a member of the Drupal community, is starting this new podcast called This Must Be the Place. It's going to focus on community from a variety of angles, like how do communities come together, what are intentional and unintentional decisions that make them who they are, and how are they shaped by different styles of leadership. So I highly recommend staying tuned from that. There will also be an episode from yours truly. But today we're going to talk about effective communication and setting expectations. Don't make your slides at 10 p.m. because you put indicators in the wrong place. So 2 of the things that we're going to talk about are communication and setting expectations, because I think they're early stages of being effective as a new leader. If you're interested in exploring some of these other things, reach out to me on Twitter. I have resources that I'd love to share, but I'd also like to brainstorm what a future talk could look like. So communication can be really hard. There's so much to be said about digital communication. People communicate in different ways. Text-based conversations can lose context, and it's not always in everyone's strength to respond in real time. So some of us might be better at verbal communications, and others may need a little bit more time to collect their thoughts and compose them into sentences. Which isn't always great when heated conversations are happening in Slack quickly. And so, if you're someone who needs a little bit more time, that's not the best way that you can engage and interact. And so it's during those moments of tension where I was really able to see a communication breakdown on my team where, we all were communicating at with each other, maybe not in the best situations. And it led to some really difficult discussions that, looking back now, are actually really helpful and interesting when you think about it from a leadership perspective. So here are the questions, some of the questions that we asked ourselves. So how does the group communicate to and from the community? So do members of the leadership team speak on behalf of the team? And if so, what happens if one person expresses an opinion that everyone else doesn't share? How do you then manage that team voice? Another important piece is having some kind of decision-making framework. In early stages of organizations, it may not be as important, but later on, as there are decisions that people start to disagree on, there needs to be a fair way for everyone to weigh in and for people to express disagreement. And, in the same way, are you making sure that all of your voices are ever heard? You can see in the chat that someone is telling us about, when they weren't able to contribute to Drupal.org, they were never given the chance. So create those chances. You as a leader want your team to feel comfortable reaching out to you one-on-one, whether that's DMs or phone call or email, but you also want them to feel good about engaging with the rest of your team. And when that team environment isn't safe or makes that difficult, I feel that it's a leader's responsibility to kind of find a way to address that. And an easy way to think about that is, how can I listen to all of the voices on this team? So you don't need to have all of the answers to these questions right now. I wasn't always successful at managing all or most of these, but retrospectively, I have some strategies that I can share, things that I learned along the way or along the conflict, and things that maybe I wish I heard 2 years ago. So one thing that really helps is scheduling regular check-ins with your leadership team. This helps you kind of understand what they're working on. It kind of helped me understand, what is it that you're excited about and what is it that you're concerned about? So then when there were moments of conflict or moments of disagreement, I could better understand where they were coming from. And that really helped provide kind of a base for empathy and connection, and kind of gave us a rapport in which that we weren't always misunderstanding each other's intentions. It was better, we better understood what we were all concerned about. Another thing that I think is really great that Nikki, as the leader of DD&I started to conduct these text-based meetings in our Slack channel. So they would happen at regular scheduled time, and people would check into threaded discussions whenever they're able to. Drupal Diversity still has these meetings Thursday at noon EST every week. It's a great way for the community to connect asynchronously. So you can check in at lunch, or you can check in later in the day, and those conversations will still be happening over time. Since my time with DD&I use this meeting style with other organizations that I'm a part of. At the Bad Idea Factory, we run this Friday book club. Most of us never get to the reading by Friday. So we post the conversation threads on Friday, and then everybody checks in throughout the week. So it's working really well for me in many different contexts. And finally, clarity really matters. And the best route to clarity is having those conversations that we're avoiding, and trying to have them as effectively and as healthy, in as much of a healthy way as possible. I found that teams that I've been on have been inclined to keep disagreements or internal conflict out of the public eye. And in many cases, looking back, I think that that may have been a mistake. I know that people and feelings are unique, but the conflicts or differences in opinion that we have are probably not. And we could have benefited from outsider support, intervention, or facilitated discussion. There's nothing really wrong with needing a third party or a mediator to to have a discussion during a conflict because of how personal this work can be. It's better to have those tough conversations instead of building resentment, especially in moments where maybe you feel like your voice is not being valued. We want to learn to have these conversations in a respectful way, and that'll make our community work a little bit more better. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about as kind of a component of leadership is expectations. When I became a leader, the day after it was announced, people came up to me at DrupalCon to talk, and we had these wild conversations. You know, everything from, I'm glad it's you because you're such a nice person. And then, I can take care of everything for you. I have 12 years of experience in this work. You're so nice. I'm happy it's you. And like, I can just take care of you because you probably don't know what you're doing. And, you know, both were very frustrating for me because it was like, well, I've never really had a chance to prove what kind of leader I am. So it's really weird that you all have all these notions of, you know, what kind of leader I'm going to be. And it turns out that just because people like you as a person, it doesn't mean that they're willing to follow you as a leader. And that's a really tough thing to understand. And it can be really frustrating when you've worked with the same people in a different capacity and you've gotten along and things have been great. But as soon as you become their leader, it's not the same dynamic anymore. It's possible that they, don't trust you as much. And so you have to work on building trust. That's a talk of its own. But there was also something that I thought about at the back of my mind, and it was like, are people just not conditioned to follow or believe in someone who isn't white? And so, you know, someone who is young, someone who is Muslim, someone who is female, someone who is a person of color, someone who is non-binary, like think about your biases in the kind of people that you imagine are leaders, and just, you know, I'll just leave that there for you to think about. And you know, when you see a leader that maybe you don't always feel comfortable with, try to address maybe whether or not that's your bias, or maybe that is something that leader does. Both can be valid. And, you know, when people had expectations of what kind of leader I was going to be, we started to run into some issues. I didn't set any expectations when I started as the leader of DG&I. I was really idealistic, I think, and also naive. I didn't know what leadership was going to look like on a day-to-day. I just assumed that things would just continue the way that they would. But I really wish that I'd started with setting some expectations. Important, especially as the leader of a group. So I think the simplest form of setting expectations would be to ask, like, here's what I expect of you. What do you expect from me? You know, and then everyone can take a moment to determine whether those expectations are something reasonable and something that they can meet, or maybe those expectations are kind of like ideal. Like, that's something I would love to be able to do for you, but I'm here right now, and this is where you're asking me to be. And like, maybe there's a path to there within the year, but that's not something feasible right now. And you can have these conversations a little bit more formally. You can map expectations to categories. There's some activities for that. I'll share my slides at the end. I've got some linked resources in the notes for each slide to kind of activities or resources that you can read. UX designers come up with all kinds of activities that groups can do together to kind of map out their expectations. And then, you know, when something big happens in the community, or, you know, some kind of dynamic has changed with your team, it's a good time to revisit those conversations and check back in and say, you know, maybe these expectations have changed. Oh, we've added a new team member. Why don't we all reassess how we expect to be working together? Yeah, Ian, if you double click on the slides, it'll make it bigger. And finally, find ways to decide how people want to be involved, and give them different ways to contribute that fit with their abilities and their time. And then one really important thing, you know, as your team is growing, is to set really clear roles and responsibilities. It's probably good to formalize this so that people know what's expected of them in the group. They know how to work together, what they need to accomplish, and how to reach the group's goal. The open source guide has this great resource page as a part of a larger resource on leadership and governance. It talks about how open source projects can formalize roles and structures. It goes into a lot of depth, mostly for technical projects, but I think think a lot of it is applicable to community-based projects as well. As your team grows, you might find that individuals want to be involved in different ways. DD&I has an advisory board of individuals. They're not always around to run meetings or initiatives, but they weigh in on conversations and provide support. Another thing you can use is a Racy Matrix. Racy stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. You use those different identifiers to, designate who is a part of the decision-making for specific activities that you do as a group. This helps you kind of streamline processes a little bit and also helps you discuss what are really high-stakes decisions that you all want to be consulted on, and what are some really low-stakes decisions that maybe you trust your leader to take into account. The digital project manager has this really great in-depth blog about creating a Racy. So I've linked that to this slide, and they've got these cool diagrams, as you can see, that help you understand. So that's a really great resource. And finally, it's important for leaders and their teams to share, discuss, talk about, and explore expectations. I didn't do this nearly as enough as I should have. I think I got really defensive when I was first starting out in leadership because I was really scared that I just wasn't good enough. And I think some of that is your personal journey as well. I just had this feeling that I was never going to be good enough to be leader. I'd gotten really lucky and, these people were never going to agree with me and follow me. And I think that really colored a lot of that really changed a lot of my interactions with the group when things got heated. I wish that I had known to step back, take a deep breath, and talk about the problem and not be afraid to, approach that conflict. I think in most cases, I was just kind of okay, I sense that everyone's freaking out. I'm just going to play mediator and do what makes everyone happy. And what makes everyone happy is not always what's best for the group moving forward. And so don't avoid talking about those expectations. It's really good. And so some ways that you can explore expectations, user manuals, you can have these, you can do them in fun activities like the screenshot where, you each have a superhero card. You can help share how you work best, share facts about yourself, better understand, how you want to be collaborating or giving feedback on things. I worked with someone who preferred to get a compliment sandwich with a feedback. So tell her something good about herself, then tell her the feedback you want to give her, just to make it a little bit more, catered to how she preferred to receive feedback. Whereas I'm totally cool now where you could just come to me and be like, your talk wasn't great. And then I'm happy to talk about what you didn't like about my talk. And it won't hurt me as much as I think it would have done 4 years ago, because I assume that there must be some feedback that's coming for that can help me improve. And so there's a lot of activities you can do. If you're a larger team, you can do a digital mural.co post-it activity where you have this virtual whiteboard, have sections that you want to fill out, and you can get together as a team and talk about it together. Thanks, Scott. My Pokemon talk is one of my favorite talks as well. And, the reality is that your mileage will vary because communities are unique. And in practice, I don't have all the answers. I can only share with you what my experience has been, and kind of looking back and kind of aggregating some of those things and turning them into these lessons that maybe one or two is applicable to you today, or maybe a week from now, you'll be like, oh yeah, that thing Fatima was talking about, that Racy Matrix, that would really help my team. So some of these lessons I learned as due to successes, but most of them was because I did something really bad. I failed at it. It wasn't working. And I had to reach out to so many people to be like, it's not working. What do I do? And read these books like Emergent Strategy to understand how can I get my team to collaborate on one goal together and get them to move forward. And so these are some of the strategies that I used. Hopefully one or two of them gives you some insight that you'll be able to take to the groups that you lead. There's so much more that can be explored beyond this. As you saw earlier, there's so many conversations that we can have in detail to further understand the effective ways that we can lead diversity, inclusion, or equity initiatives in our open source communities. There is one piece of advice that I'd like to pass on that's from my personal experience, and that is to look inward first. One of the most heartbreaking moments for me during this work with the Drupal community was that when I was leader, I was having a really frustrating conversation with someone who was my mentor, and I was explaining to them, like, my team at work is constantly fighting with each other, and we just can't agree on anything. And then my diversity team is also becoming a place where people don't feel safe speaking to each other and communicating, and they feel attacked, and so they're not communicating. And it was a place in which even I constantly felt like I was getting attacked and pushed back on and not safe, and when you are the only one of yourself among, primarily white people in so many situations, I feel like we have a tendency to be like, no one's listening to me, and I am the only person here who is trying to do the work. And it's important to not get stuck in that kind of rhetoric and to step away from that. And my mentor told me, like, the people who support you won't be the people who are in your leadership team. They will be the community. And I was like, that's really weird. I always thought it would be the team, And so I went out to community leaders for support, started reading things. One of the people who reached out and supported was Matt Westgate from Lullabot. We had these one-on-one chats. Here's what I'm struggling with. Help me come up with some ideas. He would provide advice to me. I think back on this now, and I never want another young woman of color or any other marginalized individual to come to me asking why their team is not supporting them and what they can do better. So I challenge everyone who's here today to think about, before you criticize, your marginalized or person of color leader, stop yourself and ask, like, what am I doing to support this person to be the best leader that they can be? Before we talk about what this leader is doing wrong, let's talk about what we're doing to support people in power. And with that, I'm out of time.